Alright, so this video is going to cover Objective 6 from Chapter 1, and this is the anatomical terminology. And honestly, we're not going to go into this in great detail in lecture. A lot of this is just going to be pure memorization. These are things that you're going to see throughout the course, and most of our time will be spent on this in lab. But because it is something that is kind of instrumental to the whole anatomy course, both Anatomy 1 and Anatomy 2, I do still want to take some time and go over it just a little bit. So once again, a lot of this is going to just simply be memorization. In anatomy, a lot of times in our everyday lives, we just have some common language, like we may call our stomach area our tummy, when in fact the stomach is an organ inside, and so we don't always use the right terms in everyday language. And so if you're going to nursing school, or you're going to be using these in a medical sense, you're going to want to make sure you're using the proper terms for the different body parts. And so before we can really talk about the terms, we need to understand what's called anatomical position. So we're going to talk about directional terms and left and right. And so in order to determine those things, it's always referring to anatomical position. And so there's a few key features. So anytime once again, you're using terms like directional terms, things of that nature, it's always based on a person in the standing position. They're facing forward, their arms are down at their sides, thumbs are out, your palms are forward, and your feet are essentially on the ground facing forward. Your legs are just standing upright. Now, a couple other positions could be prone, where you're laying face down. If you watch any kind of medical shows or crime shows, sometimes you'll hear these words when they come across a body. Or you've got supine, which is facing up. And here you have up as part of your description or definition, and so that word is also in the word itself. So that's one way to help you remember that. Now the body regions, this is not something that we're going to go over one by one. They're just essentially terms used for specific areas of the body. And this is something that you're going to do in lab. You have several assignments that are related to this. And this is just pure memorization. You need to memorize these. Some of these are pretty simple. You have words like facial, and most of us are familiar with that. And then there's others that you may have never seen before. Things like, let's see here, maybe antecubital, something like that. Those are not going to be used in our everyday language. I would highly recommend using flashcards to study these. And when you take tests, these are the words that you're going to see in relation to those regions or body parts. So this is just some basic background anatomy knowledge that you need to have. It's something that you need to memorize and you need to keep. So definitely a great thing to study for both lecture and lab. So here's the anatomical regions again. You're going to see diagrams that are very similar to this in lab. And as always, it's just sheer memorization. All right, so directional terms are used to describe the location of body parts or structures in relation to other structures. And once again, if you watch medical shows, a lot of times you'll hear them use these words. You don't want to say, something common everyday language like above, below. We have these specific terms that are used to reference those parts. And so once again, we're going to go over them in lab, but I do want to explain them a little bit here just to kind of help you if you've never seen these before. So first off is just basic right and left. And this can be a little bit confusing because everything in anatomy is going to be opposite. If you're looking at a person in anatomical position, your right is going to be their left, and your left is going to be their right. So it's important to remember that left and right are going to be for the patient, not for you. And so anytime you're talking about like left lung or right lung, or left kidney, right kidney, it's going to be based on the patient. So it's going to be opposite of your right and left. Now here's your other directional terms. It kind of helps, I think, that they come in pairs. So like here you have superior and inferior. Superior means above and inferior means below. There's some other words that you could use for that, and those would be acceptable as well. And then the way you use them, like some examples here, is the chin is above the navel, so we would say the chin is superior to the navel. Your eyes are superior to your nose. And then inferior is just the opposite. So anytime you're doing examples, you can just flip them and then you have an opposite example. So you will be expected to, recognize these terms and identify these pictures, more so in lab than lecture, but still very important. All right, your next pair is anterior and posterior, and this is essentially front and back. And once again, you have some other terms that would also be acceptable. To me, dorsal's kind of easy to remember because if you think about a dorsal fin, it's on the back of the fish. And so anterior is the front of your body, posterior is the back of your body. Sometimes posterior references, just in everyday language, your backside, and so that may help you as well. And so once again, you have some examples there. The navel is anterior. The navel is your belly button. The navel is anterior to the spine, and then the spine would be dorsal to the breastbone. Your next set of terms is lateral and medial, and lateral in general just means side. Like a bilateral or quadrilateral, it just means side. So lateral refers to things that are to the side, whereas medial means in the middle. And so over here you can see in the pictures, if something is more toward the middle, then it is medial. And then if something is more to the sides, it's going to be lateral. And then you have intermediate, which is if something is between two structures. So the elbow is intermediate between the shoulder and the wrist. And so most of them are going to be in pairs. This is one of them that is not. All right, your next set of terms is ipsilateral and contralateral. Once again, lateral means side. Ipsa means same, so on the same side of the body, like your right arm and your right leg. Contra means opposite, so the opposite side. So that would be like your right and your left would be contralateral. Your next set are proximal and distal. Now both of these refer to the limb, okay? So in this case, we're talking about our arms and we're talking about our legs. And notice in the definition, it says they're closer to the point of attachment or they're farther from the point of attachment. So for the arm, the point of attachment would be the shoulder. And for the leg, it would be the hip. So if you were talking about parts of the arm, if they're closer to the shoulder, then they would be proximal to the other structure. So the elbow is proximal to the wrist. The wrist would be proximal to the hand. And then distal means they're further away from that attachment point, so further away from the shoulder or further away from the hip. The foot would be distal to the knee. So that's how you use those. So once again, they refer to the limbs, the arms and the legs, and it's based on whether they're closer to the point of attachment, either the shoulder or the hip, or if they're further away from those attachment points. And then your next set of terms is superficial and deep. And to me, this one is kind of easy to remember because if you think about someone who you might describe as superficial, a lot of times it means they care about what's on the surface more than what's on the inside. So superficial means toward the surface or on the outside, whereas deep means more internal, going away from the surface. So like the lungs in your chest, they are kind of behind the ribs. And so the lungs would be deep to the ribs would be superficial to the lungs. All right, the next part of your anatomical terminology are body planes and sections. So a lot of times in order to study, we might have to cut organs or cut in certain areas or just kind of divide, and that's what these planes represent. Think of them kind of like just putting a flat sheet of paper or like a piece of glass that would go through different areas of the body, and that's what the plane is. And so the first one is sagittal. Sometimes it's referred to as lateral, and this divides the body into left and right. So it's literally coming down, as you can see in the picture. It's this one here. It's this purple one, and it's cutting the body into left and right. Now, if it's equal halves, we would say mid-sagittal, mid-sagittal, and if they're unequal, it would be parasagittal. All right, next is the transverse plane, and this is the one that goes across. So you can see this is the yellow one in the picture. It's separating the top and the bottom, the upper and the lower. The next one is your coronal or your frontal, and this is going to divide the front and the back. So that's the green one up here. And a lot of these are going to kind of go along with your directional terms. So like your coronal, your frontal, that would be your, dorsal and ventral, or anterior and posterior. And then you have your oblique plane, which just means at an angle. And so that could be in different areas of the body, but if it's at an angle, that would be an oblique plane. Next are your sections, and this is if you were to physically cut. And you may have seen this before. If you've ever looked at microscopes, you might have looked at cross sections of certain specimen under the microscope. But cross section is when you cut kind of perpendicular or the opposite direction of the long axis. So like down here you have a long bone. A cross section would go across this way. It's called a transverse cut, like that transverse plane that we looked at. And then your longitudinal section is if it's cut along the long axis. It's kind of going with that direction. And so that would be the same as like a frontal cut or a coronal cut. And so cross sections, once again, are going across, transverse, and your longitudinal are going in the long direction. Next up in anatomical terminology are body cavities. And a cavity by definition is just a space. And as you can see, there are many different body cavities that you will find inside of the human body. Some of them open to the outside of the body, others do not. It just depends on what, where they are and what they contain. And so one of the things you need to be familiar with are the organs that you'll find in each of the cavities. So here's two. Our two main ones are your dorsal and your ventral. And as we talked about earlier, dorsal means back and ventral means front. And so your dorsal cavity consists of the cranial cavity, which houses the brain, and the spinal cavity or vertebral cavity, which contains the spinal cord. And then your ventral cavity is your front cavity. It's going to be the trunk. And the two cavities are thoracic and abdominopelvic. Now these two are physically separated by a diaphragm. That's the muscle that helps you breathe. And so the thoracic cavity is commonly known as your chest cavity. And this goes back to your anatomical terms, your anatomical regions. Thoracic refers to chest. And so your thoracic cavity is your chest cavity. It's divided by the mediastinum. And these are the organs that you will find in your thoracic cavity. So kind of think about your lungs and what your your rib cage and what your rib cage protects. That includes your lungs and your heart. The pericardial cavity specifically houses the heart, and the pleural cavity specifically houses the lungs. But you'll also find the thymus, which is in your chest area. It's a gland. You've got your trachea, which is your windpipe, and your esophagus, which is your food tube. And then you have your abdominopelvic down below, and it's actually got two. It's your abdominal cavity and your pelvic cavity. Now these are not physically separated. They're just kind of a general, like, imaginary line. Your abdominal cavity contains much of your digestive organs, like your stomach, your intestines. It also includes your kidneys. And then your pelvic cavity is the bladder, part of the large intestine. Part of the large intestine is up here. And then your internal reproductive organs, like the ovaries. And so there's some examples of the cavities again. Once again, if you have a strong background in your anatomical regions, that will help you study some of these other anatomical terms as well. All right, we can also break the body up into regions and quadrants. So if you were to go in and you had some pain, they might ask you where you were experiencing that. And so the quadrants are literally just 4 different regions, and they're really pretty easy to remember. You've got upper and lower. And then remember that based on anatomical position, the patient's right and left will be opposite from you. So the right upper quadrant is actually on your left, and the left upper quadrant is actually on your right. So, but those are pretty easy to remember as long as you remember that left and right are opposite. And then over here we have 9 different regions that we can split that abdominal pelvic region into. And so you've got umbilical right in the middle, and that's kind of like your belly button region. Then you have your left and your right lumbar on either side of that. Then below that you have your iliac, left and right. And iliac is part of your, kind of refers to your hip bone, your pelvis. And so that's kind of where that term's coming from. And then lumbar refers to the lower back. And then hypochondriac, left and right, that's going to be kind of right under your rib cage. And then in the center here we have epi and hypogastric. So epi means on or upon, and gastric always refers to stomach. So it's kind of above the stomach and then below the stomach. So these are just, once again, kind of memorization. You just kind of have to practice. I'd highly recommend kind of maybe making flashcards or just using some blank diagrams for your practice. And last but not least, we have the serous membranes, or the serosa. And so inside of your cavities, there are thin membranes. And the membranes not only cover the organs, but they line the cavities themselves. And so they kind of all connect together to form almost like a little sac around the cavities and organs. And so the serous space is going to be the empty space. It's got fluid in it, but it's going to be the space between the 2 membrane layers. And so you've got the parietal, which is the one that actually lines the cavity itself. So like in this case, your pericardial cavity. The outside would be the cavity itself, and then the visceral layer is the membrane that covers the actual organ. And so that would be the one that's actually on the heart. And then between the two, you have the serous space. And so the serous space is filled with fluid. It's just going to be a small little gap area, and it's going to help reduce friction. And so we have 3 main serous cavities. You've got your pericardium, which is the one around the heart. You have the pleura, which is around the lungs. And then you have the peritoneum, which is going to be around many of your organs in the abdominopelvic cavity. And so here you can kind of see each of them. Remember, the visceral is the one that's on the organ itself. So the visceral pericardium is the serous membrane on the heart. And then you have the parietal pericardium, which lines that cavity. It's the one on the outside. And then you have the space, okay, the serous space in between, or the pericardial cavity. Same thing with the lungs. The visceral pleura is going to be on the lungs themselves. The parietal pleura is going to be in the cavity. And then you have the space in between, the pleural cavity. And then here you have, in the abdominopelvic region, the visceral lines the organs. The parietal is going to line the cavity itself. And then you have the peritoneal cavity in between. And so this takes us to our question over this section. Once you're going to have a lot more questions in lab. But the membrane on the surface of the lung, okay, is called so first of all, if it's on the lung itself, that would be the organ. So that's going to be visceral. And so we can narrow it down between pleura or pericardium. Pleura refers to the lung, whereas pericardium refers to the heart. And that is going to be all for Objective 6.